My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to what is a very special program that we do every year, the Chase Peace Prize Senior Thesis Panel. In this event, what we try to do is simultaneously honor the fine work by a recent graduate of Dartmouth, and thank you, very, very good job, as well as the foresight of the program's benefactor, Mr. Edward M. Chase, for recognizing the enduring need to carefully consider the causes of conflict and prospects for peace in our world, I should say in our troubled world. Each year, the Dickey Center offers two prizes made possible by Edward Chase: an undergraduate essay contest and a senior thesis award. Last year, Ryan McAnnally-Linz, a government major, received the Chase Peace Prize for his thesis entitled "Murder by Proxy: How Ethnic Groups Become Targets of Mass Killing." In addition to a monetary prize, the Chase Peace Prize carries with it the opportunity to return to Dartmouth following graduation to appear on a panel dedicated to the winning thesis. The Chase Peace Prize event not only showcases the winning thesis, but it also demonstrates that the work done by Dartmouth students is worthy of attention by those who know the topic best. Before I ask Professor Ben Valentino to take on the rest of the program, I would like to say just a few words about Edward M. Chase, the generous benefactor whose generosity has made these events possible. Edward Chase came to the United States from Lithuania, settling in New Hampshire as a young man. He developed a thriving furniture business, and in his success, turned to a number of philanthropic causes, most notably humanitarian and social aid to peoples suffering from the repressive regimes of the 1930s. Upon his death in 1939, he bequeathed to Dartmouth College and several other schools and universities funds to be used for an essay contest designed to encourage careful reflection on the causes of war and prospects for peace. Alas, as that bequest has grown, so has the need for such reflection. While not an educated man himself, Chase only just finished high school. He believed deeply in the value of education and learning's power to promote the cause he felt most strongly about: peace. It's my pleasure now to introduce Ben Valentino, Assistant Professor of Government and author of a very splendid work entitled "Final Solutions: Mass Killings and Genocide in the 20th Century." Professor Valentino.
Thank you, Ken. What I thought I would do here is begin by introducing our panelists and then say a few words by way of introduction, both to the panel and to Ryan himself. So why don't I just go in order here as we move away from me. Our first panelist, who's come here from the University of Wisconsin, is my good friend Scott Straus. Scott is a scholar of comparative politics, and his work focuses on Rwanda and on comparative genocide. Scott has a recent book that's out from Cornell University Press that just came out last year called The Order of Genocide. I think it's one of the best books, maybe the best book written on the Rwandan genocide so far, and I'd highly recommend it to all of you. Next, we have my colleague Bridgett Coggins. She's an assistant professor in the government department, and Bridgett studies civil wars and especially wars of secession. We're very glad to have her here and as a member of our department. But let me now turn to our guest of honor, Ryan McAnnally-Linz. And it's a real pleasure to be here to both honor him and honor this work that he did, and hopefully to engage him in a little bit of lively debate on what I think is a very important and unfortunately still very timely subject. It's rare, I think, to be able to pinpoint the precise moment of inspiration for any academic work like this, but in this case, I think I can. I happen to be there at the creation, because not only was I Ryan's thesis advisor, but I had the good fortune of having him in a class the year before he wrote his honors thesis in 2004. And as part of the class, I had assigned an article to each student to review and write a small response to. And Ryan was assigned to review a very provocative article by an academic from Ohio State, which is Bridgett's alma mater, or PhD granting institution, named John Mueller. And the name of the article was "The Banality of Ethnic War." And it's an article that focuses on the genocides in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And in that article, Mueller makes some contentious arguments, but quite provocative ones, that these were not, as we have come to see them in the media in the West, wars of all against all, in which neighbor rises up to kill the neighbor. But instead, these genocides, he argues, were carried out by small groups, groups of criminals, thugs, sadists, not normal members of society. And even more interesting, Mueller says that these people, these thugs who carried out the violence, were not, in fact, motivated by hatred or racism or some kind of cultural stereotypes against their victims, per se. Instead, he argues, and I'll quote him here just because I think it's such it sums his argument up so nicely. He says, "In Yugoslavia and Rwanda, ethnicity was simply the characteristic around which the perpetrators and politicians who recruited them happened to array themselves. It was important only as an ordering device or principle, not as the crucial motivating force of the genocide. The same sort of dynamic would have held if the thugs' organizational principle were class, or ideological influence, or left or right-handedness, or loyalty to a specific soccer team." So a very provocative statement. And that argument, I think, might seem hard for most people to swallow. And maybe one reason that it is so hard to swallow is that when people look back on the historical record of genocide and mass killing, you don't see very many examples of members of the Boston Red Sox fan team being slaughtered in huge numbers, or left-handers or right-handers being slaughtered. In fact, instead, the victims of genocide and mass killing are almost always members of ethnic groups, with very few exceptions. But nevertheless, Mueller had a good amount of empirical evidence on his side, and not just historical evidence from these cases, but evidence from a variety of different sources, including some really quite famous experiments from psychology by people like Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo. And so, as Ryan wrote his response paper, he noted this sort of paradox. How is it that if it's the case that ethnicity, ethnic hatred, racism are not the prime motivating factors for the perpetrators of genocide, why is it that then ethnic groups are so frequently the targets of this kind of violence? I thought it was an excellent question. Paper got an A. And Ryan's answer is, I think, simultaneously surprising, has important implications, and ultimately, I think, convincing. But I won't give you that part. I'll let Ryan do that. So we'll let Ryan speak now for about 15 minutes and then turn to Professor Coggins and Professor Straus. So with that, Ryan.
First off, I just want to thank the Dickey Center for giving me the opportunity and the honor to come here to campus. It's great to be back and wonderful to still be thinking and working on this perplexing question. I also want to thank Professor Valentino, Professor Straus, and Professor Coggins for coming, participating in this. I don't think it is an accident that Professor Valentino's advisees have won the Chase Prize multiple times. He is an excellent advisor, and this work owes quite a bit to his influence. So picking up where Professor Valentino left off with this question, why do we see so many ethnic mass killings and so few really that don't include the killing of specific ethnic groups? I started looking at the various theories explaining mass killings and genocides, and you can group them generally into two varieties. One group of scholars looked at broad structural factors that might explain why countries end up committing genocide, why they experience mass killings. And their answers are varied. They range from suggesting primordial ethnic hatreds that go back centuries to suggesting that there are cleavages within societies, and when situations get difficult, people act violently along those cleavages. And there are quite a bit of things to say about structures and how they influence situations, but another group of scholars has pointed out that there are a lot of racist countries. There are a lot of countries with multiple ethnic groups, and they don't all experience mass killing. It's still, thankfully, something that is fairly infrequent. They've also pointed out that in these countries, you can't predict when mass killing will take place if you're just looking at structures, because the structures stay the same, and mass killing, even in the history of one nation, is something that usually occurs at a specific moment rather than across the course of an entire history. So from those observations, they've built various theories that focus on the strategic and situational pressures facing decision makers within countries. And they've said that it's really political leaders, the tops of militaries, presidents, people who are in charge, who are spurring these mass killings, that these tragedies are built out of decisions made by leaders for a number of reasons. Their theories also vary. There are some who suggest that domestic politics really is what we need to look at to determine why mass killings will take place. There are some who suggest that it really is a state security situation. Professor Valentino offers the compelling argument that genocide or mass killing is an end resort policy, what a government in a bad situation, fearing for its continued existence, fearing for the loss of power, will resort to solve its security problem. But once again, we come back around. If there's convincing evidence that it's not ethnic cleavages or hatred or something like that that causes mass killing, that is really strategy, why do we see ethnic groups being targeted? Why isn't it that they find another way to deal with that they don't find another way to deal with their security threat? I would like to propose that there is something about the situational dynamics of responding to a threat with violent action that leads to the targeting of ethnic groups. Basically, looking at cases, I came to the conclusion that there are three general analytical principles that help us figure out the dynamics behind a strategic decision to launch mass murder. The first of these principles is that once a group of decision makers has decided that they're going to respond violently to a threat to their power or to their interests, they are willing to go a very long way to deal with those interests. There aren't moral qualms about expanding the violence, that dealing with that threat is the preeminent concern of this group of people. The second principle is that even so, they would prefer to deal with the threat with a limited level of violence, that it is actually against their interest to respond with too much violence. The dynamic behind that is that if you start killing people arbitrarily to deal with a threat to your interest, then you end up forcing those people to oppose you. You give them the choice of doing nothing and quite possibly dying, or joining that oppositional threat that you're trying to deal with. So therefore, there are strong incentives for an elite group to limit the scope of their violence and to deal with this threat in the least violent way possible. But the third principle is that they have to do so with resource restraints, they will always try to minimize the costs of doing so. It's very unlikely that a leadership group will be willing to bankrupt their state if they don't have to, if they can choose an alternative route. They depend on the support of others to stay in power. They don't want to engender other opposition by an economic collapse. So there are really physical, tangible limits set by the cost of responding with violent action to a threat that lead in tension with the goal of limiting the scope of violence to, I suggest, this form of violence that leads us to mass killings. Basically, you find these political groups that use proxy indicators, as I've called them, other variables, other observable traits about people to suggest whether or not they pose a threat. It's very costly to go around your country and sorting out only people who you know and could say prove in a court have engaged in activity that is threatening to your regime or to your interest group. And so governments that don't have the resources to do that, say governments in Rwanda or Guatemala, places where the government isn't powerful, end up using kind of a list of categories of people they think might be more dangerous to them than others. I group these proxy variables into several categories. They can be behavioral or physical. For example, if in the Spanish Civil War, when the nationalists would conquer a territory, they often would kill anybody who had a bruise on his right shoulder because it suggested firing a rifle in the Republican resistance. These proxy variables could be political. If it's found out that you're a member of a specific opposition political party, then that could mean that you are a target for mass killing. They could be socioeconomic. It could be the stereotype that lawyers or doctors or teachers or some other profession, students very often, are threatening, and therefore this elite group will engage in violence against that socioeconomic group. They can be geographical. They could be certain regions of a country where a guerrilla organization is perceived to have especially strong support. And finally, they can be ethnic and cultural. And this is the broadest group. It encompasses usually thousands upon thousands of people. And therefore, targeting these groups would seem to go against limiting the violence. But I suggest that in situations of conflict, it's very unlikely that a resource-limited government in a poor situation facing a big threat will be able to deal with that threat to its own satisfaction by targeting limited groups. And so you see violence escalate through stages where there are, say, kidnappings of specific intellectuals or political leaders, to maybe massacres at political demonstrations, finally to full-fledged campaigns of extermination like we witness in Rwanda, brutal scorched earth warfare like we witness in Guatemala, and purges of enormous scope like we witness, say, in the Spanish Civil War. I studied 4 cases, 2 in which mass killing occurred along ethnic lines. That would be Guatemala and Rwanda. 1 in which it occurred, but not along ethnic lines, surprisingly, in the Spanish Civil War. And finally, the strange case of apartheid South Africa, widely recognized as one of the most unjust, racist regimes in the 20th century, and yet the perpetrator of no mass killing. Political oppression, yes, and I want to make it very clear that I don't support any of the ideas or policies of the apartheid regime. But it's curious that such a regime would not have been more violent. And looking at these cases, I found a number of factors play into elites' decisions, but it's principally a question of whether or not they can afford, given the economic and political situation, to deal with whatever threat it is that they're facing as if it were a law enforcement manner. And taking this conclusion, this description of the dynamics of mass killing, I kind of turned my focus finally towards what that means for today, what that means for us as people who presumably feel some sort of ethical impulse to prevent or stop mass killings. And my research led me to a kind of scary, paradoxical conclusion that I was actually a little concerned about putting in my thesis until Professor Valentino told me that you have to do that sort of thing.
You still bear all responsibility.
Unfortunately, it is in my name. That conclusion is that one of the things we can do to prevent mass killings is support states and help their security apparatus. And that seems like something that you often wouldn't want to do. You don't want to take an unjust regime, say the apartheid regime, and say, hey, how about we help you out with your police force? Because that we really want you to have a strong state. But there are situations in which this conclusion, I think, can be very operable. Primarily today, we face the situations of trying to build two states in Afghanistan and Iraq, one in which the state disintegrated decades ago, and another in which we forcibly removed one state structure and are trying to build another. And in doing so, my research suggests that we should pay as much attention as possible to giving those states the resources they need to deal with their opposition as though they were criminals, to deal with terrorists as terrorists, rather than leaving them without the resources and putting them in a position where it's very likely that they will start using these proxy indicators with their security forces. And you will see things like you see in Iraq today, where the situation is deteriorating, ethnic boundaries are being hardened, and political stance is in large part being determined by religious or ethnic identity. And even today, I think we're beginning to see the signs of Iraq's security forces in frustration at not having the resources to protect themselves, to protect their families and their people, are beginning to commit massacres, to detain and kill people who very likely have nothing to do with violent attacks in the country. I'd like to kind of close with those observations and open the floor for Professor Straus and Professor Coggins to comment on my thesis, on my theory, and hopefully start a discussion with all of you on some of its ramifications and details and the inevitable weaknesses of an undergraduate honors thesis. Thank you.
What? You're sitting here. Why don't you go down?
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank Ken and Chris for inviting me, and it's just a pleasure to be here. I was a student here. I was class of '92, and so it's just a pleasure to be back, see some of my old professors in the room, and pleasure to be here on such a beautiful day. I thought I'd make three categories of comments. First, I thought I would situate Ryan's thesis in the context of the literature on mass killing and genocide, to provide some context for people who are not familiar with that literature. The second thing I thought I would do is talk specifically about the thesis and talk about the many things that I admired about the thesis. It's a really excellent piece of research. And also raise a couple questions for further thinking for Ryan or for anyone else who's interested in the room about the thesis. And finally, I thought I would talk, as I was asked, a little bit about my own research on related topics and what the implications of some of what I've done might be for the way that Ryan's thinking about this and so forth. Okay. So the topic that Ryan devoted himself to for this thesis, the causes of mass killing and genocide, is gruesome. I mean, we know it's incredibly gruesome. But it's also a topic that in the past decade has attracted considerable attention from scholars, from policymakers, and increasingly in popular culture and among student activists as well around the country. I don't know about at Dartmouth now, but certainly where I am at Wisconsin and many campuses, there are a number of student groups now who are very active on issues of genocide. And there are a couple different mutually reinforcing reasons for this surge of attention. One certainly has to do with the end of the Cold War, and with it, the rise of importance of international human rights. And genocide is clearly a critical human rights issue. The second issue, I think, has to do with a couple high-profile cases that happened in the 1990s, the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, and in particular, the mass violence that happened in Bosnia and the genocide that happened in Rwanda in the mid-1990s. Rwanda obviously is a key case for Ryan, and of course now since 2003, the violence that continues in Darfur. And I think these cases, Bosnia, Rwanda, and now Darfur, brought forward a number of questions. They brought forward certainly what we know, or we often talk about, which is the question of how to respond to mass violence. How do you stop what's happening in Darfur? How do you stop what happened in Rwanda? How did you stop what happened in the Balkans? But from a political science point of view and related disciplines point of view, I think the cases also raise the question of whether or not mass killing and genocide had common causes. And if you could identify those common causes across different regions and across different time periods, you might be able to identify what causes genocide, and that might have implications for questions of prevention, questions of aftermath, and so forth. And a number of scholars have begun to ask that question. What do genocide cases have in common as a way of identifying what causes genocide? And that research question has ended up attracting, in the past sort of 5 years, maybe last decade, a number of very smart scholars, Ben Valentino, I'd say included, or prominently among them, bringing genocide studies, the study of genocide, out of a very relatively marginalized scholarly community into mainstream debates in history, in political science, and also into other disciplines. And what we're seeing now is a real dramatic growth of interest on the topic. I, for example, did a count of all of the books Library of Congress published on genocide, just generically on genocide or comparative genocide. Between 1945 and 1994, there were 39 books. In the past decade, or between 1994 and 2005, that number more than tripled to 122. The past year, 2006, 2007, there are a huge number. I'm sure Ben gets these all the time. I get them all the time. I mean, this is now becoming a very, very major topic of interest. On colleges across campus, there are now courses taught on genocide. Ben teaches one here. I teach one in Madison, and lots of them. And so, point being, I think Ryan is very much at the cutting edge of what is shaping up to be a dramatic surge of interest on the topic that previously had received relatively little, I think, attention, and I think that's exciting. Now, that as background, let me turn to the particularities of Ryan's thesis. And first of all, I just want to say that this is an extremely impressive piece of research. It's impressive, especially impressive for an undergraduate. It would be impressive for a graduate student. I was, as I said earlier, a student at Dartmouth, and as I was reading this thesis, kept asking myself, kept reminding myself that there was no way I would be able to do something of this quality, of this perspicacity, and of this insight when I was an undergraduate here. I advise now, where I'm at a very large public university, lots of honors theses, and this would certainly rank as among the best that I've ever seen. So a real congratulations are in order to a really outstanding piece of research. But even more, as someone who knows the field that Ryan is writing about, I was even more impressed. I think that Ryan does a lot of things very well in the thesis that I want to quickly draw your attention to that may not be especially obvious for people who don't know the field. First of all, Ryan has an excellent research design. His work is comparative. He examines 4 cases. They're in 3 different continents. Just that issue of researching 4 cases requires a lot of a lot of work to figure out what happened in Rwanda, what happened in Guatemala, what happened in the Spanish Civil War, what happened in South Africa. But more specifically, Ryan, in terms of the research design, Ryan incorporates both positive cases. I put in quotes because in this case, positive cases means cases that resulted in mass ethnic killing, which is obviously not positive, and negative cases, meaning ones that did not. And I think that this is a very smart move, and until now, the trend in comparative research on mass killing and genocide really has been to focus only on the cases that did result in genocide or mass killing. But in fact, it's true that the non-cases, the ones that don't result, are much more common, and it's really important to investigate the cases that don't result if you want to try to understand what leads to the escalation of a particular conflict that would result in mass violence. And so I think that this is the wave of the future. I'll talk about this at the end. This is some of what I'm doing now. And it's just incredibly impressive that Ryan, as an undergraduate, was able to figure that out, I imagine partly with Ben's help. But he's, again, I think, on the cutting edge of future research. The second is that Ryan puts his finger on a really interesting paradox in the literature, and I think he explained this fairly well, so I'll be pretty quick. He notes, following Ben's work and others, that ethnicity in and of itself, for a number of reasons, part of which he talked about, is now fairly clear is not the cause of genocide or mass killing. There are many more cases of cases with multiple ethnic groups or racism, and genocide is fairly rare. There's the problem of timing, that if you take any country and it's got racism and prejudice and discrimination over time, but usually mass killing and genocide is a specific time period. And so certainly it's not a sufficient cause. But what Ryan also points out is, and following Ben's work, is that at the same time, many cases of genocide do involve targeting ethnic groups. And so he's asking himself, trying to synthesize these two literatures, saying, well, if it's not sufficient, then why is it that many of these cases ultimately do have an ethnic dimension? And I think that move of trying to synthesize or identify a paradox and trying to synthesize different streams of literature, I think is really an impressive move. It's the move of a more settled scholar, and I think it's, again, just impressive that he's done it. The third point I wanted to draw your attention to is that Ryan, I think, develops a pretty unusual and multifaceted hypothesis. His main argument is that identity is a proxy indicator of threat. And he argues that when facing direct challenges to authorities, ruling elites will seek to neutralize their threats. Their first choice may not be identity, which is blunt and can result in mass killing, but rather it would be law enforcement or targeted assassinations or targeting particular regions and so forth. But he argues regimes will turn to mass ethnic killing when they don't have first the administrative and military resources to collect information about what specific individuals they should target or what regions, and second, when other measures have failed, okay? And hence, in Guatemala and Rwanda, which are the two positive cases of mass killing, which are poor and with limited resources, elites turned to mass killing after other measures had failed. Whereas in racist and apartheid South Africa, which is a much more militarily and administratively endowed country, at least under apartheid, the regime could rely on mass repression rather than mass killing. And I think this is a really interesting, it's not obvious argument. I think that it doesn't rely on cliches, which is very impressive. It's counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive because I think many people would assume that because mass killing involves a lot of resources, that in fact it would require stronger states to be able to do it. And so I think it's a very interesting, very counterintuitive and exciting hypothesis. The fourth point I wanted to raise is that what impressed me was that Ryan is able to master the rhetoric of political science in this, in this particular thesis. He does a good job of reading and synthesizing a literature. He identifies a puzzle, the paradox, which he's talked about. He develops a case study research design, which will help him get at this paradox. He works through the cases. He presents some quantitative data, which is very impressive. He discusses the theoretical and policy implications, which he talked about briefly here. And he even makes predictions, okay? Now, this is, I mean, what I spend a lot of time teaching graduate students. And, I mean, all of the, these sort of very, very systematically going through and these are all components of what makes good political science research. And I thought it was very impressive that he was able to do it, again, as an undergraduate. I hope that Ryan will go further in his studies, and I wanted just to raise a couple questions about the thesis and his argument for him to consider, for us to consider, and so forth, okay? First of all, I think that throughout the thesis, Ryan is operating from a rationalist perspective. That is, that he generally is arguing that elites will go through a kind of a cost-benefit calculation about how they should respond to threats. And they will respond to threats with mass killing when they might not have the resources to do otherwise, and so forth, as he's arguing. But I wanted Ryan just to think about whether or not genocide might not, or mass killing might not subscribe to a cost-benefit calculated planning logic. That is, to what degree contingency matters, to what degree ideology matters, to what degree phobia and fantasy matter, to what degree revenge matters, and other less rationalist concerns. I'm not saying I just something to think about. I'm not saying, that would be right. The second is that I thought that Ryan might consider unpacking kind of elites or leadership and so forth, that both in terms in the thesis, Ryan talks about perpetrators or elites as the decision makers. I think one question to consider is which are the key actors? Are they government officials? Are they military people? Are they intellectuals? Are they political party leaders? Are they administrative elites, and so forth? But also to think about the ways in which internal fractures among elites might drive escalation in one way or another. That is, the elites' leadership tended to be a pretty unitary category in the thesis, and to think about, certainly Rwanda cases, Sudan now, and other cases, the way fracturing of elites might actually be a significant part of the story. The third issue I wanted to raise is the question of ethnicity. And again, a very interesting argument about ethnicity as a proxy indicator of threat. But I thought there might be some other ways to think about ethnicity in terms of nationalism, in terms of thinking about outbidding processes, thinking about even about prejudice, just other ways in which ethnicity might matter to help you round out some of the arguments you make about a proxy threat. Fourth, I thought a little bit more attention needed to be paid to Germany. And Ryan, for those of you who haven't read, I'm sure many of you not read the thesis, but Ryan deals with Germany in the conclusion relatively briefly. But Germany would be a case that would not fit the argument that he makes. That is, that Germany is clearly a case with significant administrative and military resources, and yet is the paradigmatic case of genocide. And so I thought a little bit more attention needed to be paid to that question. And finally, I thought that this is an issue that I think that anyone can pose to Ben or myself or many students of genocide, which is why isn't it more frequent? That is, if the issue has to do with threat and with resources, and we know that most civil wars happen in poor countries, why isn't it more frequent than it is? Okay. I'm almost out of time, so let me just quickly wrap up. I was asked to talk a little bit about my research, and let me just quickly raise a couple quick points. As Ben said, most of my research has been on the Rwandan genocide, and I came to this topic after I graduated from here. I became a journalist. I went to Africa. I moved to Nairobi, Kenya, and ended up covering a couple civil wars in East Africa and North Africa, and covered the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide. Got me interested in why why genocide happens, what drives many of the questions that Ryan is asking. And I went back to a PhD program in political science and began to work on this question, and ultimately resulted in the book. the premise for the research was really that we had pretty good macro level historical information about Rwanda. We had a lot of anecdotes about what drove the Rwandan genocide, but we had very poor information about how the violence spread, who participated in it, what was the sequencing of events that led elites to make the decisions that they did, and so forth. And so I went to Rwanda as a graduate student to really research these questions in a slightly more systematic way than had been done. And I guess the point that I would just raise for Ryan or for any of us is to think about field research. That is, what evidence would you be able to collect in a particular country that is of interest? Who would you talk to? How would you structure? What would allow you? What could you get that would allow you to get at more of some of the things you're raising? Finally, I just wanted to return to the question of ethnicity. In Rwanda is this very puzzling case for ethnicity, and that is the question of the fact that Hutus and Tutsis, the two main ethnic groups in Rwanda, Tutsis were the victims of the genocide. People often talk them as deeply divided ethnic groups, as ancient tribal hatred and so forth, which is really wrong. And it's wrong because Hutus and Tutsis speak the same language, they live in the same region, they practice the same religions, and belong to the same clans even. And in my research, I tried to test this, to what degree ethnicity mattered. And again, just to give you one sort of data point, that 70% of the perpetrators of genocide that I interviewed, Hutu perpetrators of genocide that I interviewed in prison, people who have been convicted for genocide, had a Tutsi family member. So these are more than 2/3 had a Tutsi family member. So these are highly integrated groups. At the same time, when I would talk to people about what happened and why what happened and how did they think about it, it was clear that ethnicity mattered. And it mattered as almost a social category. They would distinguish between Tutsis that they knew and the Tutsis. And over the course of the conflict, ethnicity became very salient and took on certain meanings. And just I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater on ethnicity in the sense that you talk about as a proxy indicator, but I think to continue to think about, I was surprised even at trying to figure out how ethnicity matters beyond just kind of hatred and beyond some of the obvious stuff. I think proxy indicator, as you argue, is very interesting, but just to continue to think about that. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Ryan, we're going to give you a chance to respond to some of those comments, but first let's hear from Professor Coggins.
I'm sorry if my voice warbles a little. I'm cold, very cold. First off, I wanted to say that I'm really happy to be here to discuss and to celebrate the winner of the Chase Peace Prize. This was a fine, really well-written thesis on an important and timely topic. It's one of the most difficult parts of research, in my opinion, is to find a research question, is to craft a research question that's small enough that you can find something tractable for your research, and yet big enough that you have something non-trivial to say after you're done, in fact, collecting your research. And I think Ryan's really struck a good balance in his work between political relevance and academic rigor. His topic isn't so proximate to, say, the civil conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, so as to that it could be interpreted as just kind of mere opinion or conjecture. And at the same time, it's not so esoteric that it precludes non-expert understanding. So in my humble opinion, it's really already a success in the most important respect. Ryan's research question derives from the empirical world, where he observes that a disproportionate number of mass killings seem to be ethnically motivated. In particular, he notes that over 80% of mass killings in the 20th century were associated, at least in part, with ethnicity. The work's central question, then, is why is ethnic identity linked so closely to mass killing? And his answer is intuitive, if somewhat novel. Ethnicity is but one of many proxies for political threat. Ethnicity is not tied to mass killing per se. Instead, the use of increasingly crude proxies like ethnicity is a desperate measure taken by fledgling regimes or movements. It's also a strategy that in the end will also prove self-defeating, as previously disinterested individuals faced with the decision either to kill or be killed are driven to support the opposition. According to the argument, the killing of ethnic groups creates monolithic zero-sum ethnic conflict. It is not caused by ethnic animosities, as commonly is asserted by others. Killing instigates a self-fulfilling prophecy of interethnic enmity. We typically don't see ethnic mass killing in rich states with strong coercive capacity because they have the resources to target their enemies with greater specificity. In fact, he argues, most leaders, even the morally repugnant ones that are under study here, would prefer not to use such an indiscriminate indicator of political opposition when targeting their enemies. It's a method only employed by those who've run out of available alternatives, or at least perceive themselves to have run out of alternatives. Ryan is in particularly good company in choosing to examine the relationship between ethnicity and civil conflict. With the Cold War's end, some of the brightest scholars and most sober diplomats have focused their gaze on the complex relationship between ethnic identity, conflict, and civil war. Be it in Sudan, Russia, Pakistan, or Iraq, ethnic conflict, civil war, and state breakdown are among the most pressing problems facing the international community today. And while strong states are better equipped to handle interethnic violence, even they are not immune. In the contemporary era, civil wars are disproportionately, in the contemporary era, wars in general are disproportionately fought within the borders of a state. Though civil wars are generally of a lower intensity than international wars, they last longer, occur more frequently, and in the end kill more people than international war. They also commonly relapse into violence after peace treaties have been signed and their resolution seems imminent. From the perspective of international law and the international community, intervention to quell civil conflicts is fraught with difficulty. The imperatives of sovereignty require that statesmen not interfere in the internal affairs of their peers or risk the return of the favor. At the same time, especially in times of civil war, humanitarian impulses and human rights concerns seem equally compelling. But the international community's opportunity to intervene in civil conflicts is limited to violations of international peace or genocide, and is additionally limited by international will. For example, in today's political climate, few are sympathetic to the political plight of those who are associated, however tangentially, with terrorism. Witness, for instance, Western governments' apathetic response to Russia's persecution of the war in Chechnya, dubbed Stalinism light by the fatalistic Russian press. Beyond that, statesmen are hesitant to commit resources and personnel to conflicts that, at least to their minds, seem intractable and illogical. Finally, as is often the case in civil war, guerrilla-style warfare makes it difficult to discriminate between civilians and combatants, since civilians also often serve as what's called a dual-use technology of sorts. They may not participate directly in the violence, but they often do provide food, supplies, and refuge to insurgents. The sum total of these complexities means that although a great deal of heat has been generated in debates over the cause and potential solutions of ethnic conflict and civil war, we've yet to generate an awful lot of light. And the precise relationship between ethnicity and civil violence remains obscured. And consequently, any prescription for foreign policy toward violent, fractured states is uncertain at best. In other words, Ryan, we need all the help that we can get. But at this point, enough of my extemporaneous comments on ethnicity and Civil War. Instead, let's discuss some of the questions and the potential implications that emerge from your study. First off, if Ryan's inferences about ethnicity and mass killing are correct, and ethnicity is just one potential proxy used to identify a political threat, I wonder if we return to the set of 20th century mass killings and we looked for things like geographic, socioeconomic, and say profession-specific mass killing, if we wouldn't then find similar rates of each of them, especially since we see, and you draw our attention in the cases, to the fact that the categories aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, there's often a blending of the two. Perhaps we're seeing ethnic conflict because we're often looking for it to the exclusion of other potential explanations. If this isn't the case, and ethnicity is disproportionately represented relative to other proxies, we might still ponder why ethnicity comes to be politicized in the first place. Even if we concede Ryan's point that ethnic mass killing often has more to do with politics than, say, skin color, lineage, or religion, we might still ponder why ethnic identity and political affiliation are so often linked. Why are there so many ethnical parties? Why is ethno-nationalism so common a catalyst for violence? And why were the RPF in Rwanda and leftists in Guatemala correlated with ethnicity at all? Second, I wonder if it's always the case that mass killing generates support for the opposition. I thought your argument as to why members of the ethnic group might join the opposition compelling. But at the same time, my intuition about human impulses wondered, why not flight instead of fight? And is it the case in all episodes of mass killing that support rallies to the side of the targeted? Or is there something special about ethnic mass killing? Perhaps its perceived centrality to identity, or its permanence that leads individuals to fight even against their impulse for self-preservation. Or perhaps flight is important, and many ethnic mass killings could have been an order of magnitude more disastrous than in fact they were. Lastly, and this isn't a specific question for you, but really more a rhetorical question about the perversity of these episodes themselves. As I was reading, I wondered why, even in cases of ethnic mass killing, if political opposition is the ultimate rationale for violence, why perpetrators don't leave room for individuals to recant their ideals or prove their loyalty. I found it striking in the Guatemalan case that the Maya were forced to choose either the government or the guerrillas. But if they chose the government, then they were exempted, at least in part, from suspicion. Tutsi, insofar as I know, were not offered an opportunity to be spared by proclaiming their allegiance to conservative Hutu ideals. Instead, they were summarily slaughtered, even as Southern Hutu were allowed to prove their loyalty. I hesitate to applaud the Guatemalan government and its handling of the insurgency. Indeed, their solution was extraordinarily violent and repugnant. But their method does seem much more in line with the Proxy story than the Rwandan case. And I was just wondering what you think explains the difference in how the two regimes handled their opponents. Why was Tutsiness itself irredeemable, whereas only a proportion of the Maya were beyond re-education or at least containment? On the whole, this was a fantastic dissertation, thesis, and I look forward to reading many more here at Dartmouth as a result.
Thank you, Bridgett. Why don't we give Ryan just 5 minutes? You've had a lot to chew on here, and you can't possibly respond to it all, but I want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience, and we can come back and you can answer some of these questions at more length. But why don't you just take 7 minutes to respond to some of these things that have been, some of these questions that have been raised, and then we'll open it up to questions from the general audience.
All right, first off, it strikes me how much how many of these questions were the ones I was fearing people might ask, because as I was reading my thesis the other week, I started asking many of them myself, and I started questioning things like rationality and whether or not the assumptions that perhaps seeped into my research from that econ major that I almost finished were really valid in this sort of case. I started thinking about things like whether or not my thesis was shaped inordinately by the Guatemalan case, which is the case that I've studied the most and can kind of, not surprisingly, ends up being the one that fits the mold the best. And so all these research and methodology questions came up as I was facing the possibility of people with more education, more expertise reading my thesis. I think I'd like to just mention the direction that I might go in thinking about the Holocaust, because it's such a familiar case and it's something that people generally know a bit about, and you guys probably have some questions about it. I, very briefly in my thesis, kind of read the Holocaust as an example of what happens if you identify a threat with an ethnic group, if you're coming out of the very strange anthropological and pseudoscientific world of the 1920s and 1930s racial research, and thinking that an entire ethnic group might be a threat to your existence because of its particular genetic traits. If that were the case, you would see what I kind of describe as very, very widespread targeted killing. But also there are a couple of interesting things that Professor Valentino points out in arguing that the Holocaust was not a first policy option for the Nazi regime, but was something that happened later, a decision that was made later in World War II during based on situational pressures. One of those is that in a lot of ways, in my terminology, the Nazis were using a geographical proxy in the Holocaust. That Jews, say in the United States, were not being defined as a threat, and as far as I'm aware, there were no plans to eventually try to, say, eradicate every Jew who made it out of Europe to some other part of the world. The second thing is that the Nazis spent a really long time and a lot of bureaucratic, I would imagine, financial resources in trying to define who was a Jew. That there was a near endless debate over the course of World War II about who do we really need to worry about, who is an object of our hatred and somebody who we need to kill. And so in this kind of very perverse logic of the Holocaust, it can be read as something of a story of what happens when outlandish pseudoscience and ideology meet up with situational pressures. But that leads back into Scott Straus's question about non-rational factors. What role does ideology play? And I think that's a direction that we've kind of seen two poles. There's a natural reaction against the inadequacy of structuralist explanations for mass killings that swings us towards thinking almost exclusively about strategies and thinking in terms of rationality and situational pressures and things like that. And I think it's definitely the moment in this field for moving towards something of a synthesis where we see how situations constrain and influence strategy. We see how non-rational components of human life come in and invade strategic realms of politics. I'd like to open up for questions now because I really only want to discuss what you are most interested in.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then we'll get a microphone to you so that your question can be heard by those who will be watching this later on the community access cable channel.
Oh, wow. Bridgett, you mentioned flight at one point, and that prompts a question that I'd like to ask. Where does ethnic cleansing fit into this? You know, the conscious effort to literally drive, you know, people out of a piece of territory. Is that always part of genocide? Is it something that leads to genocide? But where does ethnic cleansing fit in?
I'm going to answer this as I think Professor Valentino already has, because it's not something that I considered directly. And you can feel free to edit as we go. I think ethnic cleansing is a step along the way to mass killing, and there are kind of two simultaneous things going on. One is the escalation of the perception of threat from individuals to the best way to deal with this is by treating this entire group as if it were composed of threatening people, and then dealing with that. And the other question is the evolution of how do we deal with the threat. And Professor Valentino has presented a lot of evidence that just going out and killing everybody is usually not the first option. That ethnic cleansing is kind of an intermediary step when a group has decided that there's this threat that we need to deal with violently if we have to. We can't identify the individuals, and so we're going to treat it as a group, and that's my terminology coming in. But say there's another country that they can go to. Say you're talking about Kosovo, and the Serbian government would be happy if the Kosovo Albanians would just go to Albania, and they wouldn't present a threat because they would have an Albanian country, which is what they were perceived as fighting for.
Over here.
I'm sorry, I actually had class until 5, so I came and heard the summary of your thesis rather than the actual thesis. But my name is Doug Haynes, and I teach in the history department. I teach Southeast Asia. In fact, this week my students are working on comparison of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, 75 and 78, with the killings of communists in Indonesia in 65 to 66. Both cases are ones where ethnicity is not the crucial variable. It's a political affiliation with the case of communists, though there's some ethnicity mixed in with that, Chinese in some contexts and so on. And the other case where it's mostly ethnic Khmer who were killed. But in many other respects, it seems to fit aspects of the model you're talking about of regimes that are on a very unstable footing. The military in 65, 66, which is really it's in a period of a coup against the government, and the military is in the beginning of starting to take over. And in Cambodia, a regime that just has come to power. The thing that really strikes me, and it may be in your thesis, but in these two cases, killing was very disorganized. It was not only not the act of a sort of well-organized state to carry this out, but most of the killing wasn't done by, a lot of the killing wasn't done by state actors, period. And so it seemed to me that something that was involved there was the authorization of non-state actors by political elites to carry out killing that maybe elites would like to see carried out. So I wondered if you had any, since in fact many of the actual executioners really, one can't, in Cambodia and in Indonesia, really aren't elites per se, but people who are authorized by the larger ideology of the period to engage in these acts. I wonder if that feeds into your model, or would you need to make adjustments in your model to accommodate it?
I think the one gap in the thesis as it exists is an explication of who counts as elites. Unfortunately, Professor Straus's book had not been published before I had to turn in my thesis, or at least before I had to really dig into the writing. And he looks very much at what happens at local levels in Rwanda, which is fascinating. And so I think a kind of multi-tiered discussion of elites, people with power and decision-making capacity is definitely called for and something that I don't discuss. Secondly, I think that the authorization of violence is a very important element that I don't discuss explicitly. Again, Professor Straus does pay more attention to it. In the Guatemalan case, which I'm very familiar with, you actually don't see non-state actors doing much of the killing. It's almost all the officials. But you see people, say, in villages who have a problem with their neighbor or are looking to make some sort of power play, jealousy, bad history that goes back a long time, who can, in this environment where violence is the norm, can go to the military and say, this person's a guerrilla, I saw him going off at night to meet with them, and that person would conveniently disappear working in the mountains the next day. And I think the interaction between the micro and the macro, between the people who are without big political power to authorize violence or support it, and then the people with that power, is something that I don't discuss very much, but I think it would fall fairly well into this model eventually. When you identify who has the power to authorize violence and assume that in a climate of authorized violence, there are plenty of people who will take advantage of that for whatever reasons.
I'll add something on that too, because this was another thing that I think Ryan's thesis taught me. Especially this emerges from the case of Cambodia, which you're correct to point out, the majority of victims of the Cambodian, we call it a genocide, but majority of victims are ethnic Khmer, the majority ethnic group in Cambodia. But massively overrepresented among the victims are Vietnamese ethnic groups, national groups living within Cambodia. So they were not the majority of the population, but they made up just under half. I think it's 40% of the victims are Vietnamese. So they're massively overrepresented for their numbers. And this always seems strange to me in that, and I should add, as we go back and look at other cases of genocide or mass killing that occur in communist states, we find this pattern. So those of you who know anything about what Stalin did know that he targeted a long list of different nationalities and ethnicities within his country. And the same thing has happened in China, although to a lesser extent than either of these two cases. And this always struck me as quite a serious puzzle, since these communist states usually subscribe to an ideology that explicitly said that nationality and ethnicity are meaningless, that people's beliefs and identities and actions are based on their class background rather than their ethnic background. But when the rubber really hit the road and they began to try to implement communism in their country and faced opposition, they reverted in much the same ways, I think, that Ryan described in the thesis, to targeting ethnic groups nonetheless, despite the fact that their official ideology said that there's no reason we should expect that a specific ethnic group would be any greater threat than any other ethnic group. And that was one thing about Ryan's thesis that sort of helped me think through a puzzle that I'd often had with these particular cases. So,
I just would comment just for a second on this question of the authorization of violence, which is very puzzling, and it does appear quite strikingly in the Rwandan case. And I just wanted to flag it, because in the prosecution, the current contemporary prosecution, and this will probably come up with Cambodia, certainly probably not Indonesia, but certainly Cambodia now, is that the prosecutors look for intentionality in the decision-making and the planning for this kind of mass killing. And many times when people go back, it's very difficult to pinpoint a specific, direct order or plan to go out and exterminate or massively kill people. Certainly there are, I mean, Germany, probably the former Soviet Union, there it's a little bit more obvious. But Rwanda, from what I know, even of Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, and certainly Indonesia in 1965, it's a little bit more, it's a little vaguer. It's a little bit, you know, the Tutsi in Rwanda was, the Tutsi is the enemy, get rid of the enemy. In Cambodia, it was about the language of revolution and about enemies of the revolution and so forth, and so it is a slightly more amorphous authorization from leaders that does lead, for various reasons, at local areas or at the micro level, to people to pick up or to interpret that in certain ways. What's puzzling about genocide is it's consistent over time. It comes out to look very well organized and at the other end very sort of neat. And you know, in Rwanda, people often say, oh, it was meticulously planned and organized, and it was much messier than that, much messier on the ground. And anyway, the point I wanted really just to make is that I think you flag an interesting issue, and it comes up a lot in the prosecution of these crimes, and it's an issue that prosecutors and judges really struggle with if you look at all of the court judgments. Yeah.
We had a question over here.
I have a question that's a little bit to do with what you were just talking about the prosecution and the categorizing of genocide, because what we come to know, genocide is often to do with a lot of ethnicity issues. And I was wondering if what your thesis is, what you think the role of that thesis has to do in redefining genocide and in the prosecution, and how we can further predict it, and then how we can also punish it when it happens and prevent it. And also, I would be interested in what all of your opinions are concerning the role of colonization in the precondition, as a precondition of genocide.
Well, I'm by no means an expert in the legal stuff that has to do with prosecuting genocides, international law, anything like that. I would say that it doesn't matter, as far as I'm concerned, if somebody was killed because they were a certain ethnicity, or because they were a teacher, or because they looked like they might have been carrying a rifle a couple days before. And I think a general implication of strategic theories of mass killing is that in terms of prevention or intervention, it becomes somewhat more appealing if the entire mass of the population isn't hell-bent on exterminating their neighbors. If this is something that you can isolate leaders, you can restore an order in which violence is not authorized, which is the norm in most places at most times. In terms of prosecution, again, you're looking at leaders, and it points you towards the leaders. It points you towards trying to find those people who created a climate where violence was authorized, or who ordered specific actions. And in many ways, it makes prosecution easier. It's always tough to say that there was a climate of violence, and therefore we don't need to prosecute the people who actually pulled the trigger or swung the machete. But at the same time, if the goal is accountability for these specific types of crimes, and we don't want to end up with the situation like Rwanda, where there are thousands of people in jail who may or may not ever be tried, it focuses us on that kind of decision-making process. Does that address your question well?
On colonialism?
Or either.
Insofar as I study ethno-nationalism and separatist movements, and you're hard pressed to find states in the system today that haven't had an experience with colonialism. I think over 90 states are post-colonial states, and the vast majority of them have not experienced genocidal violence or instances of mass killing. So insofar as it might play an important role, I mean, I think I think that it's obvious that Belgium's role in Rwanda is central to creating and reproducing ethnic identity and socioeconomic difference. But insofar as it plays a role in mass killing in general, I think Ben might be better able to speak.
I think you've said it well, that it may create certain categories, but those categories are not of a different kind, really, than the ones that Ryan was dealing with in his thesis. So.
I was going to just comment on your other. So the question of the definition of genocide, Ben and I talk about this all the time. Usually when we see each other, we end up talking about what other possible terms are out there. It's a very problematic concept. First of all, because it's vague in what it means in international law. But what ends up happening is we have an international convention on the prevention and punishment of genocide. So people end up using the term because there's this law, and you can use it in an international court, and you can use it to potentially, although people don't now, to legitimize possibly some kind of coercive action to stop it. I think from a scholarly point of view, as Ryan does, as Ben does, there are really good reasons to move away from genocide because it is vague, because it is limiting, and to use mass killing as a possible alternative. But from a policy perspective, without a convention on mass killing, it raises the problem that it falls outside, all of a sudden falls outside of international law. And what do you do about that? So I think the point that you're raising is a good one, and I don't think there's an easy solution to it. There are some efforts, Ben and I were talking about this morning, to have something called a Convention on Atrocity Crimes, which would be an alternative. There is some, there are the Geneva Conventions, crimes against humanity are also alternatives. But one way to get, I think, at your question is the distinction between a scholarly agenda and a policy agenda, and how those can intersect. So that's the thing I would raise. On colonialism, I would just say I think that points have already been well stated, but I would say that it is possible that certain colonial policies can set in motion political dynamics that ultimately can set you on a path toward genocide. It can be too deterministic. People say, oh, genocide in Rwanda was the fault of the Belgians, which is ridiculous. But I don't know enough about Guatemala to know whether or not there were policies against indigenous populations that might have had a later consequence and set certain kinds of categories in motion. So it wouldn't be all colonialism, but it could certainly be a factor that would matter.
Actually, the Guatemalan case is interesting because the war is often referred to as the finalization of the conquista. The highlands where the Mayans live in Guatemala weren't ever really fully integrated into the rest of the colonial state, and that part of the military's project in the mass killing was and in suppressing the insurgency was to integrate these areas to finish the job that the Spaniards started when they arrived. So it's interesting to see, and I think the general lesson on colonialism is that it's specific cases, specific policies, not colonialism as a category that would really be interesting.
There's a question over here.
I just have a very quick comment and then another observation you may want to talk about. Professor Valentino's comment about when the rubber hits the road, the Soviet and communist views to take ethnicity into very, very strong account. I remember when I was in my middle teens in the 1950s, reading about Russia and the Soviet Union, and reading that the identity cards that Soviet citizens would have would include Jew, Ukrainian, Chechen, and so forth like that. And that was one of the first things that made me realize, hey, what they're saying and what they're doing is very different. Which leads to my semi-question here, which deals with the level of the ethnic tension before the actual events take place. I've observed that the German Jewish elite in the early 1930s, Albert Einstein, Hannah Arendt, and others, saw the writing on the wall very quickly. Maybe I don't know enough of I haven't read particularly Hannah Arendt's works in detail, but she certainly saw a very, very grim future. And those two were not alone. And these very alert members of an elite there saw problems which others did not, or others thought would go away. And so they obviously felt that there was a very, very deep, potential animosity here, which may not, for example, just take the Hutu-Tutsi situation, very integrated societies. One would not have looked at this. I assume that Hutu and Tutsi intellectuals would not have predicted mass problems, say 10 years ahead of time, and others. And and one other element can be the intensity of the dislike and hatred, which it seems in the German sense went beyond the actual psychopaths who actually carried it out, but what went heavily down into the society, and many elites saw that. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that or not, but it just the previous intensity, I think, is the key generality that I'm looking at.
Do you have a comment?
Do I'm
Well, we
thinking,
usually let you go
about
first.
yeah.
Okay,
Right.
I'll gladly pick that one up and say that it's always interesting to look at that, but I would not say that it would give you any predictive traction in looking for cases of mass killing along ethnic lines. If indeed ideology plays a role, then it starts to give you hints. The Hutu regime in Rwanda was repressive and biased heavily towards Hutu, but that didn't lead to, for decades, a mass killing like we saw in 1994. So you didn't really see a spike per se in tension until there was a Tutsi-related threat in the form of the RPF storming towards Kigali in the early 1990s, after which you could say there's a spike in tension, but less than, I would say that ethnic explanations of that miss the point that it was directly in response to this new military threat. In Guatemala, you saw, and it wasn't so much a rise in ethnic tension as the beginnings of popular mobilization. People speaking out, campesino activism, and things like that could have said, we're leading in that direction. We're seeing repression that might go down that way. So if you're looking for kind of the warning signs, those would take a lot of forms that might not be observable if you were looking at ethnic feelings or the tensions between different ethnic groups.
I'll say briefly, again, I think one of the strengths of Ryan's thesis is that he does a good job showing how difficult it is to really judge the extent of these social cleavages that existed prior to the conflict when you have the perspective of somebody looking back after the conflict. And I think he does a good job showing that the conflict itself not only creates the perception that they were worse before than they probably were, but actually creates the reality. I mean, look at what's now happening in Iraq. I mean, I think it was true. There's always been tensions between Shiite and Sunni populations there, but now, now those tensions are much more prominent and real. Now knowing your Sunni saints or Shiite saints is a matter of life and death, and these groups harden in a very real way as a result of the conflict. I always like to remind my students when we talk about the Holocaust, of course, Germany is a deeply anti-Semitic place in the 20s and 30s. But nevertheless, most people who studied Europe, both then and even now, to be honest, in retrospect, thought that Germany was not the most anti-Semitic place in Europe, that places like France and Poland and some parts of the Soviet Union, or what became the Soviet Union, anti-Semitism ran deeper and took a more virulent form than it did in the general population in Germany prior to the Holocaust. So I think if you were to have used that measure to predict where the most violence would have happened against Jews, you might have landed in one of these other countries. And of course, Jews did suffer there, but only after the Germans, or they were victims of the Holocaust there, but only after the Germans invaded.
Can I just ask one more question? Ben, your comment.
Hold on, let's get you the microphone.
Thank you. Question I wanted to ask is you referred to the Stalinist repressions, and my question will go to you, Ryan. I just wanted to preface it first. The Stalinist, the show trials, the repressions really were, in his mind, I think somewhat rational, at least when they began, because what he was doing was getting rid of an old generation of leaders in the party and the government and the military, and making way for a group that would fully support, the industrialization, the collectivization, and then you added on after that, the Hitler threat and the need for masses of labor, which caused a lot of people to be jailed and a lot of people to be killed, unfortunately. But what my question for you, Ryan, is would any of these things have begun the targeting at ethnic intellectuals, the leaders of, the people who would give ideas behind opposition, and then it just sort of takes on, a momentum of its own? Because I think that's what, Stalin's paranoia was a significant factor, and it just got carried away totally.
I'd like to tell a particularly striking story that I know from my experiences in Guatemala, and it's the story of a guy who ended up becoming a guerrilla general. And started fighting in the war at 11 years old. His father was I think a founding member of the organization or committee for Campesino Unity, which was the largest popular movement in Guatemala towards the end of the 1970s. And the Guatemalan military regime responded very violently to the creation of this organization. It was leftist. The regime was tied to the conservative economic elite, and it was overwhelmingly Mayan, and the regime was tied to economic interests whose fortunes had been built upon the exploitation of Mayan labor. And so this man's father was assassinated, and his family was forced to run. And as the situation deteriorated, many people who were associated with this organization gave up on peaceful means of opposition to the government and fled to the guerrillas for safety. He tells the story of having moved to different towns and having to stop wearing the traditional dress of his town. His mother could no longer wear her traditional skirts and outfits because they marked them as being from that town, which was a guerrilla town. And so you see this escalation wherein what starts as the repression of leaders of a movement eventually spreads to many people like this man who at 11 decided there was no choice but for him to run to the mountains, find the guerrilla, and pick up a weapon to protect himself. At which point you have created that opposition, which is overwhelmingly Mayan by the early 1980s, and ethnicity starts to play a much bigger role.
Well, I believe we're out of our time, although I think we could continue talking about this for much longer if we had the time. And so what remains now is for us all to thank and praise Ryan for a truly excellent thesis and an interesting conversation here today.